In this lesson, we'll be looking at the biopsychosocial model of mental health and we'll be applying it to stress. This chapter will be covering chapter 13. In this lesson, we'll be looking at specifically two types of stress called eustress and distress, and we'll be focusing on the biological part of the biopsychosocial model. So looking at the physiological responses to stress, particularly something called the fight-flight response and the HPA axis. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to identify what is eustress and distress and explain the physiological responses to stress, as well as the bodily processes involved in both the fight and flight response and the HPA axis reactions. In class, we took a look at what is the biopsychosocial model, and we used Learning Activity 12.12 to create a summary of this framework. This should be a bit of a revision, looking at some of the things that we looked at last year, but also in our introduction to psychology more broadly. In this lesson, we'll be applying it to stress, and as we looked at in class, stress is a state of physiological and psychological arousal produced by internal or external stresses that are perceived by the individual as challenging or exceeding their ability or resources to cope. So there are lots of things in this definition that you need to take note of. Firstly, stress can be both physiological and psychological, and it can be produced by either internal or external stresses. So stress doesn't necessarily need to be caused by something that is external to the person. It can be something internal, so it can be that person having catastrophic thinking and working themselves up to a level of stress. And stress is very much subjective to the person, which means that stress is how it is perceived by that person. So if that person encounters a stressor that they think they can't cope with, then that can result as stress. Whereas someone else who encounters the same stressor but does have the resources to cope with it, they might not necessarily perceive it as stress. A stress response is the reaction that involves a bodily and mental changes when people are confronted by a stressor. And a stress response can be mild, acute, or chronic. So a mild stress response can actually be really useful. It can be motivating, it can be challenging, and sometimes it's actually wanted. So for example, when you're going into a 2.5-hour exam, you do need that mild stress response to increase your body's arousal so you can actually sit through and concentrate for that 2.5-hour exam. Similarly, you might want that mild stress response to get your body into a state of arousal before a big footy game or a big netball game. If it is acute, it produces a high level of arousal, but only for a short period of time. Again, this might be wanted for activities such as exams or during sporting games. However, when it comes to chronic, this increased level of arousal that persists over a long period of time might actually cause long-term damage, which we'll take a look at later on. In psychology, we identify that there are two types of stresses: eustress, which is also known as good stress in a way, and distress. So mild and acute stress can be eustress, and this can have positive psychological responses and psychological states such as enthusiasm, motivation, and you're excited or alert. Chronic stress or distress, however, is a negative psychological response, and it can be indicated by psychological states such as anger, anxiety, nervousness, irritability, or tension. So whether or not the stressor, so the subject that causes the stress, will cause eustress or distress, it's a subjective experience as highlighted in the definition of stress itself. On the next slide, we're going to take a look at figure 13.6 in your books, which is on page 518 if you want to follow along. So this flowchart here shows how that experience of a stressor is subjective and how that can lead to either eustress or distress. So the stressor, the cause, leads to stress. So stress itself is actually a non-specific response. It's just your body reacting to this stressor by becoming aroused. It's actually your cognitive appraisal. So cognitive appraisal is how you actually interpret it within your own mind based on your resources and your perceived ability to cope, whether this turns into eustress, which is short term, and it's indicated by feelings of alertness, excitement, being energized, motivated, feelings of euphoria and positivity, or it might end up as distress, which is long term. Oh, sorry, it can be short or long term. Chronic distress is long term and is indicated by things such as negativity. It can cause damage to health, anxiety, reduced coping mechanisms, and it can be quite upsetting as well.